Welcome to the Maintainable Software Podcast, where we explore the art of improving existing software with seasoned practitioners who have helped organizations overcome the problems often associated with technical debt and legacy code. I'm your host, Robbie Russell. On this episode, April Wensel, who is a software engineer, keynote speaker, and owner of Compassionate Coding. April joins us from San Diego, California. April Wensel, we're so glad to have you join us on Maintainable. Welcome.
Hi, good to be here. Nice to meet you.
Likewise. So, as you reflect on your experience in the industry, what do you believe are a few common characteristics of, dare I say, well-maintained software?
Well-maintained software. So I know that when I have felt really happy to enter a code base and to add new things and felt excited to show new people around the code, even if there were some tricky spots, but feeling like, we had a handle on how to approach it, I feel like when the emotions around the code are mostly positive, or at least maybe curiosity. So sometimes things that maybe are not purely positive, sometimes maybe there's a challenge in it, perhaps, but still overall, the sentiment is more positive, I think is one of the biggest things. So as far as the actual details of the code, I think that that's varied, but it's kind of more of the vibes that I look for.
How often have you been in an experience where you've got to be more on that positive, excited to show someone around the code base versus maybe the other spectrum of there's some dragons over here. There's some. Don't look over there. Nobody wants to go over there. It's a little scary over there. So what's your experience been like over the years?
This won't be surprising, but the younger the company was, kind of the earlier on, usually the easier it was to feel that way, just because it hadn't had enough time to have too much gnarly stuff. So it was just getting started. And so I think a lot of times it has been the code that's been around a longer time that's been a little tougher to deal with. But that said, I've also had positive experiences where people understood that the code's been around a while, there are some issues, but we're actively working on improving it. And so I think that you can still get those positive feelings even when there are some tricky things that need to be navigated.
Do you feel like that's in any way correlated to your experience and maturity as a software engineer over the years?
That's interesting. I mean, I'm sure that's had an effect, but I guess I also pick up on the feelings of people around me. So even though now I've seen a lot of code, and so I can jump into any code base and at least, start. I mean, I'm not saying it's going to be easy, but I can sort of start. I still feel for how it affects the junior people around me. So in that sense, I always want to keep sort of a connection to how it's affecting people who maybe don't have as much experience. And also to that point, when I was more junior, I could also feel how the other people were feeling on the team. And so even people, in fact, I don't know what your experience has been, but sometimes it's the most senior people, the most experienced people that can often have sort of the curmudgeonly kind of negative attitudes about code, and maybe sort of some of the disempowering thoughts like, this is just how it is, this is just how it's always going to be, what's the point of trying to improve things, et cetera, et cetera. So I think it can be a mix both ways.
Sometimes it's an interesting thing you mentioned that about maybe more senior people feeling that way and feeling like maybe, well, it's just the way it is, and they kind of get a little dispirited at some point potentially. And then maybe on the other side, a junior developer, I have seen a lot of junior developers. My company, we bring in junior developers and interns on a regular basis, even though we're not like a very large company. But I often think that they're probably not yet in a space to be able to determine what is good or bad code. They just assume that, my perception is that they kind of write it off more of as like, well, I don't understand it yet, so it must be me, my lack of knowledge about this. So it's like whether it's good or bad code or what easy to maintain or delightful to work with, it's just like I don't understand it yet, so it must be me, not the code. So they're less maybe opinionated about it. They just assume it's probably me, not that, because obviously it must be right. And so I feel like it takes a while for me to see that people kind of like, oh, it's not just me. This actually is painful. And it's not until they maybe hear maybe someone else voice that, like maybe someone more senior and being like, oh, this is complicated for you too. Okay, maybe it's not just me after all. So
I think that's a very good point. Yeah, I think that's a very good point. And I think that's also why it matters so much that we're honest about the state of the code, because we're making impressions on these new developers, and like the whole broken windows phenomenon, where if they get in there, they're just going to kind of imitate what they see around. And if it's not good, I mean, it's interesting. I've been in situations where I'm doing a code review for somebody junior, and the feedback I want to give them in terms of how to write, maintainable code, like, clean code, whatever, compassionate code, sort of is impossible in the given system, but I still want them to know what it could be if we had a few better things in place in the company. And so I've kind of given it with some caveats, like, this is okay given what you're dealing with, but just so you know, as far as code quality, here's some tips that are sort of best practices or whatever, however I want to phrase it. But, because I think, we have this responsibility, I think, to grow the people on our team, and to, no matter what your position is, whether you're a manager or not, I think, and so the code quality definitely has a big impact because of the reasons you mentioned.
To provide our listeners with some context, something you just mentioned there, and I'm going to dive into this deeper with you, is could you explain what compassionate coding is?
Sure. So yeah, that's my company, Compassionate Coding. I started in 2016. And my idea there was that a lot of times when we would talk about code quality, it would almost be in these terms of what's right or wrong and what's good or bad. And I thought if we zoom out a level and look at how the code is actually impacting the human beings, then we can approach it from this holistic kind of viewpoint. And so compassionate code, most relevant probably to this conversation, we'll talk about how you write the code and how you work with the people writing the code. But really, compassionate code also takes into account how you feel when you're writing the code, and how you feel about what you're producing in the world, the impact it's having on society, how we're collaborating with people who are not engineers in terms of, designers, marketers, like business people outside of tech, etc. So it's this very kind of high level overarching way of looking at software development that's much more like human driven on every level. But that said, again, like I said, for this conversation, I'm focusing more on how it affects the actual code rewrite. And so I think it's it's not different necessarily from things like clean code, etc. It's sort of compatible with all that stuff, except it's more about what our intentions are going into it and what our mindset is and what we care about, really focusing on how it's affecting people versus just some abstract, this is just a better way to do it, but actually what's the actual impact? And so the reason I use the word compassion is about noticing suffering and then trying to alleviate or prevent suffering. And so when we talk about code, sometimes there's suffering. Like you talked about, people are complaining, oh, this is scary, oh, this is hard, oh, this is difficult to work with. And so coming at it with an angle of compassion, you're like, okay, how do we alleviate some of that suffering? And sometimes it means refactoring. Sometimes it means, better documentation. Sometimes, it means more training for certain people. But when we approach it from the angle of compassion, it sort of opens up what we look at rather than just trying to follow some rigid set of guidelines for what code should look like.
So it's not something you can just stick into like a linter automated thing into your GitHub Actions, and it'll be like, yeah, this isn't compassionate code necessarily.
Yeah, probably not. I have thought about because the one thing I've thought about automating is code review comments, like being able to gauge kind of the compassion level, so to speak, because I did a bit of sentiment analysis in college on text, and so I thought, oh, maybe there could be a way to do, and actually, since that time, there are now some tools that do look at code review comments, and people may have seen it even on social media sites, or it will say this is sort of an angry post you're about to write. Are you sure you want to put it out? And something like that. The problem is it's, really, because to really approach it from compassion, it's not about following a set of rules. And so it's more about kind of this internal mindset thing about how you're approaching it. And so I think that's why I've been less drawn towards, putting it in a linter, and more it's about changing the actual humans doing the work.
It's an interesting thing. I hadn't thought about diving too far down the path of code reviews and just that back and forth process for this particular conversation. But I've talked with some people about how there's a certain way, you might have a template for how your team might put together a pull request, and then people doing code review, and then when there's the process starts to break down. I feel like when it comes to training people, when it comes to how to receive the information, receiving feedback is a hard thing for me to kind of try to figure out how to help educate people. It's one thing we talk about how we're being really mindful and compassionate when we're responding or providing a code review, but how do we then interpret someone else's language and understanding their context of where they're from and what their culture might be like, whether that's a regional thing just within where they live within the same country, or you live in different countries, different teams are spread across. There's a lot of other things to think about, and like, how do I be empathetic to how they approach communicating? I feel like that would be really difficult to kind of codify into some sort of like automated tool.
Yeah, I do think it would be difficult to automate. I do. It's interesting you mentioned that, because when I do exercises with teams in the trainings that I do, the feedback exercise we do is actually giving and receiving feedback. And so we kind of combine it. So, and an interesting exercise we do that people have told me helps them build empathy for people who give feedback is we take some feedback that they've received that's been difficult. So something that either like maybe was a little bit upsetting or they disagreed with, caused some emotions, and then have them translate it into the same framework that we're using to give feedback, like in the workshop. And what's interesting about that is it kind of requires you to at least make some educated guesses about what the person really meant by what they said, even if it wasn't delivered in a way that was easy for you to receive. And so, yeah, but there's a lot of steps to receiving receiving feedback. I think part of it is just being able to filter it. So like you're somebody who produces things and puts them on the internet, and so am I. And you get a lot of feedback, and some of it's really great and some of it's really positive, and maybe all yours is positive. I don't know, but in my case, sometimes you get the not so kind feedback, and sometimes even in the least compassionately delivered feedback, there's some gem. And so it's kind of an ongoing process I try to have, whether it's about my code or the content I'm producing or whatnot, to be able to filter, like, is this just a matter of this person and I value different things, so they're never going to, appreciate this? Or is it something that I could take on board and be, and try to adjust? And I feel like that applies in our code as well. Like, I remember earlier on in my career, I would get like conflicting feedback from different people on the team in my code reviews, right? Like, oh, this is the more idiomatic way to do it. No, this is the better way to do it. And I early on was like, I mean, both work, both seem fine to me. Do we really, And so I think that's one of those cases too, where people can get too rigid in their thinking instead of, think at the end of the day, this is probably fine and whatnot. But so again, I think it requires, a lot of thoughtfulness on both sides.
Hey folks, it's me, Robbie. I want you to take a moment and close your eyes. Now picture your code and your applications as a symphony. Now to keep that symphony playing smoothly, you need an orchestra of tools. That's where our podcast sponsor, AppSignal, takes center stage. They combine the elegance of error tracking, the precision of performance monitoring, and the harmony of logging into one symphonic suite. Whether you're composing with Ruby, jamming with Elixir, orchestrating with Node.js, or harmonizing with Python, or maybe even a little bit of flourish of JavaScript, AppSignal's got the sheet music for you. And here's the crescendo. Plans start at just $23 US a month. That's gotta be music to your budget's ears. Plus they're certified ISO 27001 and they dance the GDPR and HIPAA compliance beats. So don't miss a beat, my friends. Head on over to appsignal.com and tell them that your good friend Robbie from Maintainable sent you. Now, open your eyes and let the symphony of smooth coding begin. Let's get back to our show. To transition back a little bit, thinking around specifically, you mentioned like refactoring and maybe working on documentation, things that you can do to improve the existing code bases. In a recent article you wrote, you mentioned that compassion plays a significant role when dealing with legacy code. So how does fostering a compassionate mindset help teams tackle, say, technical debt more effectively? You mentioned like there's some specific things you could do, like refactoring and things like that that might make things better, but like how else do you kind of like approach that?
Sure. So I think the first thing is noticing, so you encounter legacy code and you're like, oh my gosh, this is so confusing, or why did they do it this way? These people have no idea what they're doing. You feel some like really negative emotions or whatever. So first I would say, have compassion for yourself. This is a difficult situation. You are having to navigate something that's a bit challenging. And it may seem kind of silly to pause and do that, but there's research that suggests that when you are more compassionate with yourself, like you're better able to solve problems and you're in a better mindset to like have an approach mindset where you're trying to figure stuff out and you're wanting to see possibilities. And so I do think getting your own mindset in a healthy place is valuable. And so practicing some self-compassion can start. And that also prevents what you mentioned earlier about how juniors sometimes internalize it and think, oh, something's wrong with me. I would say that even as a junior, if you're entering a code base and you're totally lost, like I would never blame yourself. You know what I mean? I would always have compassion for yourself. Even if it is because there's a skill gap and you need to learn some things, you can still have compassion. Okay, so you start with compassion for yourself. And then you think about who wrote the code and the circumstances they were in. I often refer to the prime directive from Agile retrospectives, which, roughly is like, regardless of what we discover, we understand and truly believe that everyone did the best job they could, given the circumstances, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that that's really valuable when you're approaching legacy code, because whatever things that somebody did in the past that maybe you disagree with, or maybe there's new technologies to do it in a better way, to handle it in a better way, they had their reasons for what they did. Like maybe somebody was breathing down their neck, like, you have to get this out tomorrow. I don't care what it looks like. We're going to throw it away. And sometimes we don't throw it away. And sometimes, yeah. So, the company's not willing to invest in the tooling or the training or experienced engineers, et cetera. And so you can have compassion for the difficult circumstances someone in the past was in when they wrote the code. And that's important too, just because, again, it keeps you in this mindset of, oh, I can accept what is, and let me just focus on how to approach it going forward. Because we waste a lot of energy and mental energy and focus blaming the past or feeling negative, and you're just not going to have a great time when you approach problems from that mindset. So that's why those steps are important. And then it's about, what harm is this code actively causing in the moment? And I think that, again, you can look at that a few levels. We already looked at how it's affecting us. That's why we practice self-compassion. It's affecting our coworkers, and it's ultimately affecting everyone in the business if it's slowing down, how fast we're able to add features or fix bugs. It's affecting our customers, whoever they may be. So it's having this negative impact. And so, but compassion kind of helps you probe into that more deeply to see, how is it affecting them? Because sometimes, you can have some code that maybe doesn't look pretty according to certain standards, but it isn't touched that often, and it actually is pretty easy to understand, and there aren't really any problems with it. It's not affecting customers. Then, you know what? Maybe it's fine to just let that go, So I think if you approach it from compassion and look at the different parties involved, it sort of helps you prioritize too. And then compassion also comes into play in terms of communicating the importance of addressing the technical debt when you do decide that it is a priority. So you're not always going to have the freedom as an engineer to just fix anything that needs fixed, right? There's competing priorities. And so I think being able to navigate those conversations with other stakeholders, compassion is such an important tool for that, similar to how it is in giving and receiving feedback. Sometimes I like to think that a lot of times most conversations we have involve giving and receiving feedback in some way, even if it's just our facial expressions or, our body language. And so trying to explain to people in engineering and outside of engineering why technical debt matters, why it's important to fix these issues, being able to have empathy for what they care about, what are their values, and then framing the importance in language they can understand. I'm not a fan when people say explaining things to non-technical people, because I think people who don't code can still have very deep technical knowledge about a variety of things. So although I don't say it like that, I will say that being able to express the importance of fixing legacy code and technical debt, that sort of thing, in terms that are relevant to the other person's domain, I think. So the impact on the business, the impact on hiring, the impact on performance, how it's affecting the customers, all that sort of thing, I think compassion comes in handy. So as you can see, it comes in handy in a lot of different ways.
I'm curious I'm trying to think of for our listeners, come up with I think it's one thing to talk about trying to understand people in another part of the business, or to talk about hey, we're talking to the product owners, we're trying to explain something in marketing or what have you, and hey, this is impacting us as software engineers, but this is going to impact your part of things. We're not going to be able to deliver things as quickly. Do you feel like there's a tone change, or what do you see as kind of being a key differentiator? Is it just being, where's that line between compassionate and being empathetic, or just also trying to communicate something? And is it more explaining? I'm just trying to think if people are listening, be okay, so give me a tangible example. What's different outside of saying hey, this is hurting us, please allow us to do this, it'll make our lives better? Is it can you elaborate on that a little bit, or maybe talk about it, maybe an example that comes to mind?
Yeah, absolutely. So a lot of times I've seen very experienced engineers who are very good at the code, and somebody will join. This actually happened with a team I was working with recently. So somebody new joined the team, very skilled engineer, really senior, and they looked at the code and they're like, oh, well, we could easily fix this and fix that. And they even made a comment, we're spending 95% of our time fighting the code and only 5% actually being able to code, because it was like that bad of like a legacy code situation and technical debt. And so, she was trying to convey this in like a product meeting. It was just, well, we're using this outdated framework that does this and that. And actually we have this new thing and this will handle like, and getting it all to the technical details of the situation, which again, the engineers loved hearing because they were like, oh yeah, that makes sense. And that sort of thing. And so I think it's a matter of knowing your audience. And so in that case, it wasn't the most effective because although it was clear this person was very upset, the people listening just sort of heard a lot of sort of complaining about terms they didn't understand. And so that's the way it was received, was this person's, yes, upset. I don't understand what they're talking about. And it sounds like it's going to be this huge thing. And like, I can't deal with that. We have these features that need to get out next week. So let's focus on that. And it sort of shuts down the conversation. I was kind of coaching this person and I was explaining that one thing that's helpful is to frame these things instead in terms of the impact on the business. And it's not enough to just say, oh, and this will impact the business, right? I mean, sometimes that's enough. If you have a good trust built up and you have a good relationship, sometimes they'll take product people will just, and business people will just trust that and then say, yeah, of course, if so-and-so says that this is going to affect the business, I trust them. Let's address the issue. But if you don't have that, or if it's somebody less familiar, et cetera, then sometimes you'll have to start from, explaining kind of sometimes even first principles in terms of the idea of technical debt. I mean, that is sort of a jargon word. I mean, people sometimes have heard of it, but don't really know what it means, et cetera. And that requires some empathy, just determining whether or not somebody knows that. And it may be asking, like, are you familiar with this or that sort of thing. So I think asking questions and that kind of thing, and making sure that, like, again, if you've done the steps that I talked about in terms of having compassion for people involved in the situation, then when you share what you're trying to share, it doesn't come across as accusatory. Like if you come across like, well, you made us push out all these features, so that's why we have all this technical debt. Because a lot of times that's how it's heard, is the business people have pushed us. That's why we did this terrible code. And that's why it's your fault that it's harder, and it becomes this kind of blame game, which shuts people's down. And so I think sometimes the tendency I see among engineers, and I think the thing that they often can benefit from working on most, is thinking that making a logical argument is enough. And it's rarely enough, and psychologically, like, we make decisions mostly emotionally, and then we justify it and we rationalize it, right? And so that's true of all people. And so when you're talking to somebody, it's like, it's rarely about you made the exact rational case for why this makes sense. That does help. I mean, it helps to provide maybe even data projections on the delay estimated, the cost for technical debt. It definitely helps to bring the data to the table, but it also helps to be able to understand what that person cares about on a deep level and be able to connect the two. So the emotion, like, help it resonate in an emotional way by connecting with what their core values are, tying that back into the very rational argument that you want to make. And so I think that's one of the easy examples. I think too, staying open to compromise and staying open to different perspectives and not framing things again in these binary terms of right and wrong, black and white, good or bad, because maybe there's some middle ground that we can reach, but you have to, stay open to it in order to reach that. And I think a lot of times when you feel very strongly about how code should be and how things should be, you completely shut down the possibility that this quote unquote non-technical person you're talking to might have actually some good insight and some good help in terms of reaching a conclusion that works for everybody.
You make a lot of really good points there and some good advice for people to kind of reflect on. I was thinking around, been in so many conversations where I've heard engineers will be talking to something and be like, we need to do this, this, and this because this was done wrong, or this is legacy code, or this was outdated. We wouldn't do it this way anymore. Now we got to rewrite all this stuff. And you just kind of get this blank stare by other people being like, what are you talking about? And so if you want to do that kind of work, I would just, for anyone listening, become a consultant and then get hired to come in and like do these kind of like make these bold things and then not have to be responsible for doing it. That's a whole nother thing. But, I'm thinking about for like some tangible steps for people like in those conversations. I think you mentioned like you were coaching that person through that process after kind of maybe witnessing that happen. But that sort of thing happens over and over and over in so many different meetings I've been a part of, even people on my own team. And there's always this like in the moment you can only do so much. Do you have any advice for people that might be in one of those conversations and they're observing it in someone else on their team and they're like, rather than just being like letting it sit there and just kind of lay flat and maybe let that flail in that scenario, any advice on how they might help interject or offer some to help smooth out that scenario so that they can help everybody kind of get to where they want to go if they're kind of observing that there's kind of an obvious disconnect between the person saying something, an engineer, to someone else that's like, this seems like an engineering team problem, not my problem. We need to get this stuff shipped.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I think it's being able to jump in like that is definitely a delicate situation, right? Because on one hand, you don't necessarily want to interrupt people and kind of take over and explain, kind of put words in people's mouths and all of that. So it's a delicate situation. But a way to approach it is to kind of practice, a skill that people learn sometimes is empathetic listening. And it's kind of where you hear what somebody says and then you repeat it back to them to check for understanding. And so I think a way that could be applied in this situation is somebody says like, well, the framework X, doesn't have these features and da-da-da-da. And you can see like somebody listening and they're just glossing over or they have a confused look. And it's like, I think sometimes you can, when that person pauses, who's going on with the technical details, you can say, oh, so it sounds like what you're saying, and then rephrase it in a way that's more accessible to the audience. And that sort of, one, leads by example because you're showing an example, but you're also asking it as a question, so you're not trying to presume that even what the person was trying to convey, because, it's true, we might be misunderstanding as well. And then, you're kind of being that bridge. Like, I see a lot of the work I do in terms of like teams, I often see it as bridging because I'm trying to bridge between, different viewpoints, not necessarily, just different viewpoints in general, I think, is an important skill for anyone to grow. And so, you're leading by example by doing that. But that said, I would pull that person aside, like if you have that relationship, and kind of, mention to them too, if possible, because especially if it keeps happening, and maybe there's other ways to address it within your organization, and it depends on, like I said, your relationship. But I think in the moment, I think being able to say it, like check for understanding, and then say that, and then you can convey it in terms that we talked about, like in whether it needs to be in business terms, whether it needs to be in, how it's affecting the customers, et cetera. It sort of varies. I think jumping in and kind of helping convey that can be helpful.
I can appreciate that. You're touching on being in these types of engagements. Could you talk a little bit more about some of the services that you offer? This is a chance to pitch yourself a little bit.
Oh yeah, that's what's funny is I don't actually do that a lot because I know like nobody wants to hear pitch, so I like rarely do that. But say just to explain like what I do, because usually I let like teams reach out to me, and it usually is when they're struggling with something or they want to improve something, and it's communication issues on the team, whether it's trying to create a better code review culture. I've written and spoken a lot on code reviews and healthy code reviews, and so that's an area I like to help teams out with, giving and receiving feedback, all that kind of thing. And so what I do is I do some informational intake interviews with people on the team and then come up with a training program for them. And I like to do it that way because I know as an engineer, like listening to repetitive, like kind of bland, generic training is not fun or engaging. And so I try to target it to each team. And so it varies. And so it really depends on the situation that team's dealing with. I have some common, threads, of course, and some common like resources, but the way I explain it for video game companies, I try to interject examples from, gaming and things like that to make it, more relevant and interesting. And so I try to, use the domain, practice some empathy, like I said, for the domain of the people I'm speaking to. And so then we do like a hands-on training where they do practice exercises, they do that giving and receiving feedback, they do introspection, learn about like mentorship, leadership, again, it kind of all depends, but it's all very interactive because nobody wants to be spoken at to fully, especially in this day and age, people like to be, hands-on engaged. So at least, not for too long. So I've been doing that for 8 years now with my company.
We'll be back with our interview with April in just a moment. Hi, it's me, Robbie. I just want to take a quick moment to say thank you for listening to the Maintainable Software Podcast. Thanks to all of the votes that have been tallied, we are now the #1 trending technical software podcast about technical debt and legacy code on MySpace. Wait, I think I might have just dreamt that happened. But anyways, if you're a big fan of the podcast or listen to it, or maybe even loathe it, if you could write a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify to help spread the word, that would be great. 1 star, 2 star, 5 star, 7 stars, whatever. I don't care how many stars. Just get over there and click on the thingy and do the thingies. Thank you so much. Now let's get back to our interview with April Wensel. That's wonderful. So another topic that I wanted to touch on with you is, you mentioned it earlier, was around being enthusiastic when you're bringing new engineers to existing projects. What sort of patterns have you seen work well for like improving onboarding experiences for and is that specifically, maybe if you can delineate a little bit across from like bringing in senior level type people versus junior level type people, like do you cater towards one or the other, or try to have a good hybrid there about how you're thinking about the information and the onboarding experience that people are going through?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it's very similar. I think the things that are different are kind of basic environment setup stuff. You might need a little bit of a higher touch with more junior engineers, and understanding kind of the bigger picture of things and whatnot. Might need some more hand holding, and I don't mean that in a negative way. I mean in a positive way. I think holding hands is great, and so like might need a little more guidance there. But I think the big successful approach that I've found is pairing. So I think whether it's junior or senior, I think a great way to onboard somebody is like pairing for the first week or whatever makes sense. Because then you're kind of seeing the tools that are used there. You're seeing how people work. You're seeing how the communication works. Do things come in through Slack? You're kind of observing and participating and, absorbing things. And that's honestly what I found to be the fastest. I mean, I did an interview where I was the interviewee a long time ago with Pivotal Labs, which is like, a consulting company doing agile development. And it was for a startup that was using Pivotal Labs like resources to build the company. And my interview was a pairing exercise on actual code like used in the startup. And they were still able to help me contribute on, through the interview and whatnot, because when you have maintainable code, approachable code, you really can like help people jump in like almost right away. And so I think that can be really great for onboarding. I think one approach that I've seen that's been helpful is like having the person who's most recently onboarded like date the onboarding documentation or process or whatever it is, like to give feedback so you're constantly improving that. I think that's really helpful. Those are the things that come to mind most. And what I've seen, like on the opposite side, like the reason I mention this is because sometimes like people just drop someone in and be like, here's several decades worth of messy wikis and readmes and things that are contradictory and Google Docs and all of this. Good luck. And even a senior person, I don't think that's the best approach, because yes, they will be able to navigate it. Yes, they'll be able to, but you're putting this huge cognitive burden on them unnecessarily. And so I would err on the side of making it easy to bring somebody on and making it, and sometimes a good way to test it out is to like have interns, even if you're not actively hiring, to bring on interns temporarily for the summer or whatever to sort of get exposure to that. Because, they always say one of the best ways to learn something is to teach it. And so as you're teaching like how your onboarding works and how all this stuff, how the process works at your company, you're going to learn stuff too. And you're going to pick up on stuff that that doesn't make sense anymore. That is way outdated and whatnot. So I think that's why the pairing helps, because then you're actively involved. You're not just like, good luck, because someone who's recently joining a team is maybe not going to be the most eager to give feedback because they feel they don't want to rock the boat too early on. So they may see some huge gaps in onboarding, but maybe they don't feel comfortable giving that feedback. Whereas if you go through it again, you're like, oh, I didn't realize how hard this is. And so you can watch them struggle. So part of it is the pairing is watching them struggle and having empathy, having compassion, and being like, oh yeah, we shouldn't make people do that. We need to, so.
I like that approach. Something that I often will recommend to people is like, if you're going to be hiring people in the near future, especially let's say you have a typical web application or something your organization works on. I'm like, how nervous would you be if you had to get a new laptop tomorrow and start from scratch? Like, how long would it take you to get everything up and running and get back to delete the application from your computer, get rid of all the configuration, like pull up the README or the documentation and like go through it step by step. Don't skip steps because you know how it works. Like follow the documentation, deal with it, and let's see where it breaks and fix that before people show up. And then still you can let them do it. My opinion on that is like, don't put too much pressure on the people coming in, because you were saying like they're not going to be as critical. And they might also make assumptions that also just if they're just back to maybe a compassionate thing, and just you don't want them to go spin their wheels on something. I think another thing that ends up happening with a lot of weird things with documentation is like there'll be a lot of weird edge case things that someone encounters, especially when someone knows enough to be dangerous and they find like some weird edge case scenario, and so they document that, and then now that's going to be in your documentation forever until someone realizes that you can remove it. Because who gets rid of the edge case documentation unless you're the one that knows that it's no longer relevant? And this is another thing that documentation becomes very, very difficult to maintain, because you don't know why it's there because you never encountered it, but you don't want to remove it for the next person that might encounter that weird edge case thing. Like, well, if you have this weird thing happen, and I've seen that happen a lot of times because it's just like someone had a weird environmental setup configuration issue on their computer. Anyway, I'm going off on a long weird tangent there, but it's complicated. And you mentioned like all the documentation and living all the different places. It's so hard to get rid of documentation in organizations, especially if you didn't produce it and you don't know if it's still relevant. Any advice for people on how to navigate that?
It's similar to code, to be honest. I mean, I think the refactoring approach works well. You know what I mean? It's like, leave it a little better than you found it. It's like always a good approach. And so even people who are at the company, even if you're not hiring somebody new, people are going to be looking at it from time to time. They can improve things like that they see. But then I also think leadership especially, I think it falls on them to take the time. That is something that's so valuable to spend some time on, is the communication that you're putting out to the team, and that includes the documentation. And so I think, not that leaders, would have all the context to maybe like fix everything, but they at least have a lay of the land and can figure out who to delegate what to. And I think prioritizing that, because what I've seen that's caused some issues is when I have seen those sprawling documentation things where it's in multiple platforms, way too many platforms. Sometimes the manager will just be like, oh, just figure it out and, ask if you have any questions. And like almost like didn't take ownership of the fact that this is something that we should address. Like, oh yeah, our documentation is kind of everywhere, but just deal with it. Like it falls on at least when I am leading a team, like I feel like I need to take ownership of that, because like that's part of like taking pride in my work. Like that's part of the craft of software development, is the artifacts that go along with it. And so I think that's part of creating a healthy culture. And I think taking the time to do an audit, to do, regular reflection on how to improve that. And, in the same way that occasionally with code, the answer is to start over, occasionally with documentation, you may need to start at least from one and then figure out what's missing and then just add that back in.
I think that often ends up being sometimes how we end up with these sprawling environments of documentation. I would, to some extent, it would be like, well, if we had things in Google Docs, we put things in Confluence, like, well, that was getting a little messy and outdated. So let's move over to Notion and we'll have a clean slate. And they don't necessarily go back and clean up remove the other stuff or archive it and just make it so people can't stumble across it anymore. Like, it's hard to get rid of stuff. It's harder sometimes.
It's very hard. Yeah. I mean, I think there's no easy answer, but I do think having a process where you archive things like systematically, I think can work well. And this is, again, where it's helpful to have people on the team that have different strengths, because some people love that stuff. You know how like there's professional organizers? Some people love that sort of thing. Like they would love to dig through all of your messy stuff, and anyone, who has that kind of information hierarchy skill set would love to dive in there and clean it up for you. And so I think being open to people with different personality types is part of this, because then you find somebody on the team that like they would jump at that. They don't see it as tedious. They like love doing that. Like some people love organizing their photo albums on their phone and like so good search is a good short-term fix, even if it is across multiple platforms. Having a good search kind of helps, because I thought of that because of the photo thing. It's like they say it's probably not worth organizing all your photos these days, like because you can search it pretty well, as long as you can search it pretty well. And so I think it's similar. As long as there's good search, like that might be okay. And, looking at the dates on stuff is super helpful for navigating all that stuff too. But yeah, I do think it's something that's worth considering and investing in. And again, you might have to have those empathetic conversations to get people to give you time to do it. But if you can make the case for the lost time and the morale hit that happens with poor documentation, it's definitely possible to make progress on that. And I've seen it happen.
You mentioned maybe getting some time reserved or allocated to do those types of things. I often wonder if, do you feel like there's anything different about the nature of the work that we're doing that we feel so under this time crunch in the same way that other people in other departments do? Do you feel like they think about it in the same way if they're reorganizing their work environment, their tools? I keep coming back and thinking, does someone in accounting need to go say, you know what, can I get some extra time to reformat my spreadsheets in my reports? Or do they just do these things because this is the stuff that needs to be done? I don't know. Something about maybe because we attribute time too much to what we do. What's the estimate on how long it's going to take? We have, whether that's a good thing or bad thing for our particular type of role in the process of building software, but something I keep recently been thinking more about. I'm like, I don't know. It feels like such an odd thing. I'm like, you're responsible for these things. It's your tools to sharpen, your environment to work in. How do you organize this? And it's like, well, I have to get permission to do that, or I have to get time allocated.
I tend to agree with you on that. And I actually think if you have high trust in your organization, you don't have to ask permission. You just do it. And it is part of your work. In fact, it's assumed that you're going to be spending part of your work refactoring code or improving the documentation or helping your coworkers grow, etc. Sadly, a lot of organizations don't work that way. And so I will say, though, to your point, the interesting difference, I think, between accounting and the kind of work we do is, through the daily stand-up or, through status and things like that, on the good side, we're trying to give transparency into our complex work. And so we're like, here are the things I worked on. And so in the interest of transparency, people often will say, oh yeah, I updated the script on this, or I updated the documentation, I improved this, that sort of thing. And because otherwise it's like, what did you do yesterday? You didn't check in any code, in some cultures, right? And so I think because of that tendency for us to kind of sometimes overshare, maybe, I don't know. And whereas accountants, it's kind of like there is sort of that black box a bit, sometimes. I mean, I don't know specifically with accountants, but like, I think because the nature of the work that we do, like there are so many moving parts to it, we try to help with that by telling people what we're doing. But then when we do things like that, where it's sort of like,
why did you spend time on that?
Yeah, exactly. Why did you spend time on that? So again, like most issues, if you go deeper, the real issue is, creating a culture of trust and that kind of, and embracing transparency. And then, you don't need permission. You just do it. It's seen as part of your work. But again, those are deeper issues to address. And so sometimes you have to deal with, the situation you're in.
I'm curious, do you find yourself more often on team rewrite or team refactor?
Oh, that's a good question. If I had full reign and like went according to my personality type, it would be full rewrite all the time. Like I'm kind of a perfectionist. I like a fresh start and I, like that kind of thing. But that said, I'm more often on team refactor, and that's because I live in the real world and, know the constraints involved. That said, I actually enjoy improving things. One of the ways I best learned about refactoring was I was at a company and we actually had Sandy Metz come in and do a training. And she's amazing, and her work's amazing on refactoring. And it was so fun. And so when I, was applying that to the code, I was like, this is just fun. It's fun to like take something and make it better. So I actually do love refactoring too. And so again, in my way of avoiding binary thing, I think I can appreciate both approaches. It's not that often that we get to do the full rewrite. And I will say one point on the full rewrite, or doing rewrites, is that I was at a company and they had so much legacy code, so much technical debt. And they did, decide, okay, we're going to have this team break out part of it and try to, do a rewrite. And what happened was that turned into this sprawling nightmare, a multi-year project. And it's because they didn't refactor, so to speak, the underlying organizational cultural issues that had led to many of the problems in the technical debt to begin with. And so they didn't make those improvements, how we prioritize work, how we scoped things, how we, figured out user stories and broke down tasks. And so because they repeated those same patterns, this fresh new rewrite basically reproduced all the same problems. And so that's why, I think, although we love to talk about the code and stuff, that's why I so often talk about the human stuff, because it'll keep showing up. You're just going to keep reproducing the same problems unless you actually, grow in the ways that you need to in order to improve things. So that's just a caveat in terms of the, in the rewrites.
I completely agree with that and have seen that so many times over the years, especially as being more in a consulting capacity here on my end. And so often whenever I go into people and they're talking about a rewrite, I'm like, so what's going to be different? You can talk about the code. And even then sometimes they're like, well, we're going to do it in a different way. And they might talk about like their new ideal feature, about the architecture. And okay, that's great. But how are you going to change the rest of your workflow? How are you going to avoid getting into a similar situation? And then just kind of come back with blank stares. And it's just like, and then sometimes it's also from a place of like, well, we inherited this mess, because a lot of people that are on teams may not be the people that originally created I'm air quoting the mess that they're in. It's, it was the predecessors. And so you go back to, earlier being empathetic and compassionate, thinking about prime directive, about like, well, they did the best that they could with the constraints they're given. Maybe you could reset and do it again, but then you're also having to maintain the existing thing while building the new thing in parallel and make that all sync at some point and move the data across or move the custom. It's a whole complicated thing. As soon as you start going down that path, and it's like, well, that actually rewrites are really, really complicated. And that's why we have a podcast called Maintainable, trying to make maintainable software. For those listening who might not be familiar with Sandy Metz, you can listen to her episode, which is episode number 50 on Maintainable. I'll include a link in the show notes there. I have a couple of other quick questions for you. One thing that you recently wrote about not too long ago on your newsletter was around community service and volunteer work. So what role do you see community service and volunteer activities play in building empathy and compassion within tech teams?
So I love volunteering with different types of groups. I've volunteered with some coding specific groups where I'm helping to teach code or help people make a career transition. And so I'm mentoring. And so there's that thing where, you're that approach where you're applying your skills and it is very relevant. And so from that angle, the way it's a helping tech is you're expanding the set of people that have access to tech or that have familiarity, that get an entryway into it. And so there it has a very direct impact. But I also do some sort of outside of tech community service. And so I volunteer picking fruit in people's backyards and then donating it to feeding organizations. And you might think, well, what does that have to do with tech? But on one hand, that's sort of the point, is it helps kind of with the internal kind of mental health stuff in terms of getting outside in nature, being around people. So it helps with the self-compassion. It also helps, though, like understand people who definitely are affected by technology because they're living in the modern world. And so it gives you some, familiarity and insight into how people think that aren't coding all the time and that aren't thinking about, the latest technology and the latest devices and hearing like from real people. I mean, well, developers are real too, but you know what I mean? Hearing from like people who don't share the same experiences that you do. And that can help you in, when you're designing, coding things, whatever it may be, helps you grow empathy in that way too.
Hey folks, it's Robbie here. I just want to take a quick moment to plug my own company, Planet Argon. We're a software consultancy that helps organizations improve their legacy software applications. We offer staff augmentation and provide fractional development services for those that don't need multiple full-time developers. We specialize in technologies such as Ruby on Rails, React, and Laravel, just to name a few. If you work within an organization or have in the past and they're struggling with technical debt, legacy code challenges, or figuring out how to leverage new features, send them our way. We're here to help modernize their platform and make their applications shine. Visit us at planetargon.com. Again, that's planetargon.com. All right, let's get back to the show. It's interesting. I think back to pre-pandemic, because my company, we'd always be in the same office in the same city here in Portland, Oregon. And now we're spread around, and so we'd meet up in person rarely, right? And so our ideas of volunteering now is much different than it was 5 years ago. But there was a period of time where I got to a point where I was like, you know what? If we're going to do volunteer work as a team, we are not doing technical related stuff. Like, let's go off. We're going to go to the food bank. We're going to go plant trees. We're going to do something different. Let's get our hands dirty if we can, if we're able-bodied to do that. Let's go cut blackberry bushes down, whatever, for the local community. That'll be the thing we do, because I feel like it was a different sort of team building thing, but also just to get us out, be part of the community was, I thought, another important thing. But also I just felt like that whole aspect, I'm like, we do this day in and day out, and let's take a break for our brain and do something slightly different, learn how to work with each other in a different way. And where none of us are the experts. We're all learning. We're all equals too. I feel like it was a good way as a team. So regardless if you're a leader on the team or anyone on the team, junior person, people had different skills and different things, and you might get pulled into being a volunteer in a different capacity. I thought that was a good way to kind of just shake things up for ourselves, I suppose. So I thought that was interesting that you wrote about that, and like you mentioned on the self-compassion and the mental health aspect of that as well. A couple of other quick class questions for you. So I always like get a little bit of advice from our guests. So imagine there's someone listening right now who's been a part of a team for a while, and they feel like they've asked for maybe get some time to do X, Y, and Z, maybe improve the existing code base, but they've heard not right now, maybe a few too many times, so they've stopped asking because they just assume it's never going to happen. Outside of just saying, I'm going to go get a new job at some point, and the grass will be greener over there, and they'll let me do everything I want to do. What advice could you offer them on how they might approach that today?
Definitely, again, starting with the self-compassion, because wow, what a frustrating position to be in, that you've been presenting this problem to people and asking for help about it, and you just keep getting turned down, so much so that you start to feel this learned helplessness of what's the point anymore? Like, just what a tough spot to be in. So I think practicing some self-compassion is good. And then I think doing a little bit of troubleshooting and figuring out where is the disagreement, the point of disagreement between you and whoever's saying you can't work on this, if they're saying that. Also, yeah, that's actually worth asking too. Are they actually saying that? Because I think sometimes we over-interpret, like what we read too much into what people say or what they do, and so maybe we haven't been as clear. So you could start asking, like, was I clear about what I actually wanted to do? Did I make it clear what the scope would be? What are their objections really? So that's one path, and then you can go down, the path of trying to like talk with them more or talk with different people, see if you can gather like-minded people in the organization to help build kind of like a coalition in terms of, doing the cleanup. Maybe that means starting like an engineering effectiveness kind of like group, guild, whatever you want to call it, that kind of gets to do that sort of stuff. And it is endorsed by the organization, or maybe you can, ask them to get a percentage of time to work on things and presenting it in a way, like I said, that affects the bottom line, affects the business. So that's one path. And then for those who, are a little more open to like, risk and taking, I don't know, like taking things into their own hands, what little changes can when you are making changes to the code base like already. And, because that's not something that's like overly policed, so to speak. I mean, that's not something that, people are going to come in and just say, how dare you have, changed, 20 lines in this file instead of just 2. I rarely see that happen. It's just very unlikely. And so I think if it doesn't massively balloon how long a task takes for you in a way that's very easy for somebody outside to sort of detect, I say go for it. You know what I mean? Like you're doing your job of implementing this feature. And as part of that, because of the values of the organization, presumably in terms of delivering value to the customer in some way, then it actually does help with that. So I don't think you're doing anything wrong either. So I think that, those are kind of two paths. You can either, keep going one path, but if you really are hitting up against a wall, try the other. And you said, short of leaving, but I will say, like, I'm definitely someone who says life is too short to stay too long in a job that makes you miserable. So I will say I do not look down on anyone who decides to move on. And I think a lot of times we're a little too cautious on that, and people get the advice like, if you job hop, no one's going to hire you. But I will say I did a lot of job hopping and I never had trouble finding a job. And yes, that's one example, but I will say that like I don't be afraid to decide your time and the contributions you're making are so valuable that you want to be somewhere where they're appreciating you enough to like let you do the job that makes you proud and is fulfilling.
Excellent. I think those are some really good things for people listening to think about. And if that's you out there and you need some advice, feel free to reach out to April and she'll maybe give you some more pointers there. Is there a non-software, non-technical book that you find yourself recommending to peers?
I will go with 12 Steps to a Compassionate Life. It's by Karen Armstrong. It was life-changing for me because it talks about compassion, how compassion is essential to almost all world philosophies and religions, and that it's not tied to one, but that it's this common thing that unites us as humans. And it talks about how to apply it in very practical ways in your life, and that it's like a lifelong process. And so it was a big eye-opening thing for me. Clearly, I think we can use more of it in tech, so I would say that one.
Wonderful. I'll definitely include links to that in the show notes for people. And where can listeners best follow your thoughts and ruminations on these topics online?
My website's compassionatecoding.com. I do have a newsletter that you've done some investigation on, so that exists there. That's on my website. People can sign up for it. It's a free newsletter. And I'm on Twitter sometimes at April Wensel. I know it's not a great site anymore, but I am there because a lot of people are still there, and I'm trying to reach them and build bridges. I'm on Mastodon and Blue Sky as well, but there's too many of those platforms. But the website, I'm going to stick around there, so that's probably the safest bet.
Wonderful. Well, it's been such a delight having you join us on Maintainable, April. Thank you so much for stopping by to talk shop with us.
Likewise.
Maintainable.